want to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brandflakes here, back with a new Shadowverse 2 video. Today's video is going to go over the category of decks that I think now exist in the game in this new set, and kind of explain how we've gotten to the meta that we are in now. And I guess the greatest example of this is the fact that we've gone from a very tempo/board-based meta, where the main objective was to fight for the board and make sure you either control the board to push minions into your opponent's face, or you control the board to have minions, or to not have those minions push into your face and then survive until your win condition is satisfied. So for example, the ones for the first part were going to be stuff like mid-range Abyss, Swordcraft, even kind of Puppet Portal, not that it was really that good, and then I think that's it. Like, those are the three main decks that existed for fighting for board. Again, obviously Puppet Portal was not that great. And then the other side was usually like stuff like Rune and Forest, which wanted to survive the board onslaught so that they could, you know, smack their opponent with either the Roach combo or with the very infamous Cositus Declimb combo. So these were things that existed before. So stuff like Gildaria, stuff like, well, mostly just Gildaria, obviously. Like, Gildaria was very powerful. Oh yeah, stuff like William, example, very powerful because they controlled the board and they interacted with the board in a way that left you something to work with, so that you could either go for face or continue controlling the board with existing minions and force a response from your opponent to kill the minion you were with because they had to. Now, this set is very different because of a lot of the new archetypes and decks they have printed. And what better deck to start off with than Cresthaven? So you can see here on my screen, I have a bunch of labels for stuff. So like anti-board. Anti-board explicitly mean, or like refers to the fact that these decks do not actually care about maintaining a board themselves. They just want to make sure that you don't have a board. These decks will often have a lot of removal cards and a lot of healing. The healing is mainly meant to counter certain playstyles, like all these bottom ones called Me Face. It's to deny these decks their win condition of just smacking you until you're dead. And then obviously anti-board is just to make sure the board is clear so that they don't die to lingering minions or get one-shot from board and hand damage, so that they can just kill you with their win condition. So for Cresthaven, their win condition is going to be the passive burn that they gain from Marwyn. So if you somehow haven't seen the horrifying abomination of Cresthaven, which I'll be honest, I did not see coming at all. This is like a deck that I guess in retrospect was very obviously going to be good, but because of how different set 2 was, I never thought a deck like this would be good. But with all that said, Cresthaven works off of Marwyn's Crest. Marwyn is a 4-mana legendary. When you evolve him, he gives you a crest where at the end of your turn, if you haven't attacked at all, so this is like a pacifist/AFK quote-unquote playstyle for Haven, you deal the same amount of damage to your opponent's board and their face as you do have crests. So this obviously caps out around 3 crests, and generically speaking, you will have at least 3 crests active anytime after the mid-game, because you'll be playing stuff like Grimnir, Marvin, and Wilbert, all of who have permanent crests. Now, small side note, where I've heard that Wilbert is falling out of favor by a little bit because he has a tendency to get Odin'd. We'll see if he's going to be in the list in the long run, but just a small note for any crest would-be players. And then we also obviously have the new support they printed with Devotee of Repose, which gives you a 4-turn countdown crest, which is extended by Marvin's spell, which we can see here in Torrent of Despair. We have stuff like Supplicant of Repose, which gives you passive healing turn by turn if you haven't attacked, which is a bit weaker, but mainly exists to give you the crest for the Marvin value. And then we have Conqueror of Repose, who gives you a crest where you draw if you don't attack. So obviously, again, a lot of these cards are just meant to give you crests and give you value for not attacking, which is important because of how Marvin works. Now, I think one of the minions I want to go back and apologize to is the Devotee of Repose. I thought the Devotee of Repose was going to be really bad because you wanted your opponents to attack into ward minions that had attack, but because of the massive amount of damage you get from Marvin, what ends up happening is that you don't really care if you have 0 attack, because you're going to clear their board for the most part, almost always, unless some freak accident happens. And if that freak accident happens, then you not having attack on your ward minions rarely matters, because it's not like the ward minion would have mattered, because they would have just super evoed and cleared it anyways, or used a card to clear it. So apologies to Devotee of Repose, that is my bad for calling you one of the worst cards printed in this set. So I talked about earlier when I went over anti-board is that how they really just want to heal and clear your board. So the healing aspect of Wardhaven is going to be covered by stuff like Temple of Repose, which gives you some pretty decent healing, and also Barrier to your leader, which prevents damage from one hit. And then we have stuff like Shining Disenchantment, which gives you a lot of healing. Another card that I rated really low because I didn't realize that it wasn't engage move by 1. It was engage advance the amulet count by X. So you can play this and activate the same turn if you have 4 or more crests. So it's way better than initially expected. And then we have stuff like Madding Benson, which was a terrible card last set because Haven just didn't have enough cards to give crests with. Which, if you didn't know, if you play this card when you have 5 crests, the crest no longer activates, which means that you will no longer be at threat of taking 10 damage from the Maddening Benson crest, and therefore it means you've healed 10 HP for 2 mana, which, as you might imagine, is kind of nuts when there's no downside at all. And then obviously stuff like Unholy Vessel, we have stuff like the 4 mana deal 3, a lot of other cards in Haven are meant to be board control so that they can just clear the board, not attack, and just watch your minions explode over and over again as your HP drops lower and lower and lower as they grind you out with Marvin's Crest. So beautiful example of how the board control from last set is really relevant because against something like Crest Haven, they're not trying to maintain a board versus you. They're just trying to clear your board and not die so that their passive win con of Marvin Crest can just kill you slowly. And a really good example of that kind of different flavor, but the exact same concept, is actually Izudia Roach. Izudia Roach is another deck type of the same nature where all you're doing is just waiting for your win con to finally take into place and then killing your opponent instantly with that win con. And then all the support around that win con are just cards that stall, are the cards that clear your opponent's board and aren't really that good by themselves, but you're playing them because they really mess your opponent's board up, and therefore you can't die to or therefore you don't die to your opponent just having a few minions left over, right? So like Cruel is here. I thought she was gonna be one of the best forward costs in general, even playable in Forest or in Roach rather, but she isn't because she's too slow. But she is playable enough in Izudia Roach because she is very efficient. She gives -2 to enemy board, and your crest is a good stall tactic for certain matchups. Even stuff like Deepwood Fairy Beast, which I thought was never going to be playable ever, is actually really good because of how the meta has developed, where again, having board control, having minions on board is a lot less relevant. So what that means is that cards that were really weak to your opponent having a wide board are now really strong because you only have to clear 1 or 2 minions at a time. And Deepwood Fairy Beast with Super Evo is efficient enough, but for the most part. It's a 7/7 when you Super Evo it, and that clears most minions in the current meta. And then with its fanfare, where you heal an equal number of health as you have cards in your hand after the initial card draw, you heal a lot. And that's again very relevant because of the nature of the face decks we have, where they aren't actually maintaining a board to continually hit you with. They're just playing cards that deal immediate damage, and then just like that's all they expect to do with that card. Like it's just like, oh, deal damage, and then there is no consistent pressure. It's just that burst of damage I'm working with. And then stuff like Conqueror of Killing is just, it is kind of going back to the board control aspect, but it's not board control in the traditional sense where you're fighting to keep it on board. You're playing Conqueror of Killing because it just kind of clears the board for you, and it's a very efficient way to hold the board and prevent your opponent from hitting you in the face. Because while there are certain conditions with Izudia Forest where you are ironically using Conquered of Unkilling to win the game instead of Izudia OTK, it's not the main win condition, and it's more for those niche matchups like versus Loot Sword, for example. And then obviously Izudia himself is here just to provide the OTK. You get a copy of him played initially with an Evo, and then you get another copy of him, or you bounce the initial copy, and then you just slam the opponent in the face with 20 damage and kill them. So it's again a deck that does not rely on having a strong board ever. You are just looking to get your opponent's board clear. You're looking to get your HP total high so you don't die, and then at some point you just pop your opponent, and that's that. Going on to the more traditional decks that still exist, we still have decks like that. We still have decks that really want to use their own minions to control the board and have minions to make sure that like you either have to clear them so they don't die to you, or you have minions left over so that your opponent's next few minions are cleared more easily by yours. So the age-old monster with Rune, I didn't even bother putting in the board control aspect of Rune in this preview because we all know what Rune does. Rune will just play minions that exist to trade with you, and Greya exists to control the board. Stuff like Norman exists to control the board and heal you. Stuff like William, who is again much less popular than before, exists to control the board. And their main win condition, assuming they don't just randomly tempo you out with Norman with golems, is to just play combinations of like Demon Call with Kuon and Dimension Climb to one-shot you with a fat Kuon monster, or it's going to be something like Ruler Crusadus with Dimension Climb to one-shot you with, you know, the ever dastardly like Astaroth Super Evo Ping Kill. And there are even combos now with Kuon and Gilneas, who probably should have been here, where you play Kuon, your Super Evo Kuon, or you play Kuon at 10 mana and then you Dimension Climb, and then instead of needing another Kuon to get the kill, you actually combo them with Gilneas with the 5 mana spell to get that 5 damage from Gilneas being played. So instead of just dealing 10 damage with Kuon Super Evo, or maybe like 13 with the Monocall, you can add +5 with Dimension Climb because you got Gilneas. So even that is just more like a control board with actual minions, or minions that want to be on the board to control it with, and then just one-shot your opponent later in the game after you've kind of gotten there. And the distinction is that it's not anti-board, because Rune's board interacting minions and cards do actually leave something real behind that you have to kill, or else Rune can just beat you down with a Kuon much earlier than expected. Whereas with Cresthaven and Forest, or Izudia Forest, while there are sometimes scenarios where they can just kill you from board, like for example, leaving a Wilbert up, and if the Cresthaven player is playing like a random Griffin, they could kill you like that, but that's much less common than the usual win condition for Cresthaven. Stuff like, so this is actually not Face Dragon, but this is the Fenny into Jerry plus Crusadus OTK. This is another deck, so I think this deck would rather be up in anti-board than in board control, but because Dragon has fewer really powerful generic board clear cards, like they have stuff like Draconic Strike, which is theoretically a very classic board control card, but because it's not as ubiquitous as like a complete board wipe as something like Cup would be, it's still there, but you're still gonna be playing stuff like Neptune, like Seabro, like and a bunch of other cards that generate actual minions with Dragon, so that your opponent is forced to trade with them, and that you have minions to trade into with. So not necessarily as much of a board control deck as Rune is, but because you are still being forced to play minions that need to be on the board to do stuff, that's the reason why it's more board control-y than Rune is, even though the one-shot of Fenny Jerry Crusadus Dragon is still like a very funny one-shot. So if you're wondering what the one-shot is, basically you play Fenny at one point, and then this discounts Jerry and Crusadus down to a point where you can play them both simultaneously, and then ideally you have a tablet as well. So you play Jerry first, and then you Evo Jerry, and then you play Crusadus to reduce your deck total to 10, and then assuming you somehow don't have the other tablet, that means you win in the next 2 turns, outside of you getting more card draw through other means. But if you play tablet, because Crusadus' deck only has 4 unique cards, you drop down the card total to 4, which means that you win on your turn end. So that's how the Fenny Jerry Crusadus OTK works for Dragon. And then we have the most honest and traditional deck in mid-range, or not mid-range, but in Modibus. So Modibus is really honest, or Modibus is straight up the most set 2 deck we have in set 3 that is still set 3 themed, because you have so many new cards with Mode. And so the reason why I think Mode is a lot more popular than traditional mid-range, I mean, to be fair, the way that Mode is being played right now is literally just mid-range Abyss, because you are just playing big minions and forcing your opponent to have a response to those big minions, or else you just beat them down and you win through the long game. So since Mode is more of a mid-range, like Mode's much more easy to wrap your head around, like again, it's much more classical, but if we just tab out of this screen really quickly and we go to the rankings, I think you might notice something interesting about how the current state of ranked is. So class rating, oh, we have somebody actually going really far with Forest recently, which is quite nice. So hopefully, I need to figure out what this Forest deck is for myself. But we see here that Abyss was doing quite well. Like Abyss is technically barely higher than Loot Sword. There's a few Abyss players that are technically better than the top Rune players. So Abyss is quite good in this current, like it's like also obviously lagging behind Crest is not that bad of a sin, but we can see that Mode Abyss is pretty good in terms of ladder climbing. And the reason why I think that is because Mode Abyss doesn't necessarily have a strict win condition like all these other decks do. Like you don't win easily with Crusadus Decline, you don't win with Izudia OTK, you don't win, well, you don't like quote unquote guarantee a win by running your opponent out of cards like Cresthaven does. What Motivus does instead is that it just plays such good quality minions over and over again, and it just forces your opponent to have the cards they need to actually win. And because they have such a high level of consistency with that game plan over a large amount of games, the the favors that you're not really favored in from like a conceptual standpoint actually end up being quite even to slightly winning for you, because the odds that they have a response every single time is a lot lower than you having the card to force a response every single time, which is kind of the nature of mid-range, obviously. So Motivus, ironically, the most honest of all of these decks, but still just preys upon the idea that these quote-unquote better decks can low roll, and then Motivus will beat that. So the final type of decks we want to go over are these decks that I mentioned earlier, where they play cards that are really fragile and are meant to be dealt with, but because they deal damage to your face almost every time, it matters way less. So these aren't decks that necessarily want to maintain board control, but obviously if you can't remove the minions they play, they just gain a lot of value from that, obviously. Like, we all know how Zirconia smacks people into the dirt if you can't answer Zirconia, right? And usually even aggro Loot Sword is doing that. But these are cards that all just have really good value in one cast, and then they just hope they kill you in that time. So obviously aggro Loot Sword, we know what Loot does if you've been playing or watching the game at all. Quick Blader, obviously 1 damage 1/1, which can do a bit more damage if they don't have an immediate answer, is very high value. Octress, she gives a crest that gives you the Remnant of Hollowness, which is again 1 mana, deal 4, super efficient, technically really bad long-term value. Or I mean, it's really good trade, like it's really efficient. 1 mana, deal 4, technically AoE is really efficient, but you're using this mainly for the 4 damage to face. Stuff like, I mean, Albert, Odin, Centaur, Tentacles, we all know what these do. These want to go straight to your face to deal face damage to you. And Sincero, while he is a very powerful board control card, quote unquote, we all know what he's mainly being used for. He's being used to deal 8 damage to your face with his Fanfare into Super Evo. So these are all cards that don't necessarily have much staying power. They aren't very sticky. Sincero alone has really strong base stats for his mana cost, but they all do one thing very well, and that's to hit your face. And so the reason why these anti-board decks still work into Loot Sword, like these two decks are probably some of Loot Sword's hardest counters, it's because they, one, the minions that they play, since your minions are fragile due to the fact that they're meant to be one-time value cards, minions are fragile, so therefore these decks can play weaker minions that have healing effects or better like auxiliary effects, because they can actually clear your minions. So like, again, example, Fairy Beasts can exist against Face Sword because they can actually clear the minions that come out one at a time. And then because you're playing these one-time cards, if you don't, you yourself are on a timer, because if you don't win within the certain number of cards played, you just get out-healed and out-sustained, and then you just run out of gas and you lose to anything that could happen from these two decks. Face Dragon is, you can see the fast, medium, half and half. So obviously aggro Loot Sword is the fastest style of face deck here on this list. Dragon is going to be very noticeably slower because their quote-unquote one-time value cards are all later on in the deck. So stuff like Gaum is technically 7 mana. She's mostly played as like an AoE board clear against stuff like Loot Sword, but against those decks that don't really play minions, like again, against Cresthaven and Izudia Forest, she's being used as a 7 mana 5/5 to go face. Forte, classic face card. Warrior of the Deep, not really one of the most popular tech cards, but again, can be played to go face. Genesis Dragon Reborn, one of the best single burst cards in the game because he can deal 12 damage to your face with a Super Evo. Odin, pretty classic. Garyu even has a place because Garyu also deals usually like 5 damage to face with a Super Evo, which is very high value, but he kind of trends into that aspect where, again, most decks aren't equipped to deal with these X mid-range based cards, so Garyu ends up being super annoying because, for example, you played Garyu into Izudia Roach. This Izudia Roach player suddenly can't clear all 3 dragons without like a really strong hand because they're expecting stuff like just an Odin, like just a Forte, like just a Warrior of the Deep. Garyu being slightly wider is even more threatening because you can't deal with the 5/4 barrier minion without letting one of the other minions live, and then because you let another minion live, your healing card has way less value because you're not actually gaining, like, you're healing but they still have range left on board, which means that the healing might not be good enough. And then we have arguably the weakest deck, or the weakest craft in the game, with Egg Portal. And the reason why I have half and half in there is because Egg Portal ironically sucks in the current meta, or yeah, it sucks in the current meta because it has the forced versatility to be healing constantly. And because Egg Portal is being played as like this raw aggro deck where you're even resorting to stuff like Dogged One because your class doesn't have great neutral or doesn't have great storm options. You have Orcus, but Orcus sucks with eggs because eggs take up puppet spaces. So you have to play stuff like Dogged One to have actual access to storm units because you're just trying to go face. You're playing stuff like Axia, who is your best Super Evo target because she breaks your cards, which might trigger a damage egg and then deals damage to enemy face, so it goes face again. And it's bad to be half and half because instead of getting those random healing procs, which granted do help against stuff like Loot Sword a decent amount because you heal out of their range as you're playing cards, but wouldn't you much rather just kill your opponent way faster? Like for every healing egg that you got in the early game, like especially against decks like Rune, against Rune, Cresthaven, and any version of Roach, like you'd much rather just be able to kill them one turn sooner, which is what would happen if you had pure damage eggs, right? So I think that's why Portal Egg is actually the worst archetype, is because again, it is forced to dip into this aspect of like utility that it really would rather not have because its game plan is to kill, it isn't to sustain. You don't want to go for a long game as Egg Portal, but you're forced to kind of put your toes into that because of healing eggs. So yeah, that's this video. Oh, the placeholder deck is actually a real deck, by the way. It is also a face deck with Stormhaven. I haven't seen anything about this, but I just made this because I heard, or someone commented asking about this, and I saw a comment on Discord about how they play Apostle of Veracity to give this 2/2. So the idea is that this 2/2 Storm Dragon or Storm Bird, you Super Evo it, so it's a 5/5, and then you play the Apostle of Veracity on it, so it becomes a pay ahead 1 mana, but it's a pay ahead 1 mana, and then you spend 4 mana on Apostle of Veracity to make a 9/1, which is really funny to me, so I just wanted to put this here. But again, exact same concept. Like Stormhaven would go into the same category as Face Dragon because they're both medium paced decks that kill you by like turn 8 or 9 with a big fat swing, as opposed to Loot Sword, which could kill you on an Odin turn on turn 7. So yeah, hopefully this video was informative. I think it's a really interesting evolution of the game, just because we do actually have real diversity with how the decks are structured, instead of everything just being me board, me use board, hit face, and all that. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good day or night wherever you are, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye bye. Also, I really gotta check out that Forest deck. I need to know how Forest is now the top on ladder after making a coping video yesterday. It's kind of weird.